The P-51D Mustang weighed a little over 7,000 pounds empty. It measured 32 feet from spinner to tail, spanned 37 feet of wing, and carried 6 half-inch machine guns. Yet the airframe beneath that shape spent its first 2 years failing at the one job the war would come to demand. It was designed for the British, around an American engine that lost its breath above 15,000 feet. Reconnaissance pilots flew it low across occupied France. Dive bomber crews rode it down onto Sicily. Bomber gunners over Germany died waiting for an escort that could not reach their altitude. That small British order of 320 aircraft became a program of more than 15,000. 2 nations built it. One of them built the engine that saved it. The airframe climbed out of its low-altitude cage. It reached 42,000 feet, then Berlin, then Tokyo, then the valleys of Korea. Its range came from a fuel tank that made it unstable when full. Its speed came from a liquid-cooled engine that a single bullet could drain. It was not the fighter America wanted. It was not quite the fighter Britain ordered. It was neither a fast interceptor built for home defense nor a rugged brawler built to absorb punishment. It occupied a space no one had specified in advance. A single-engine fighter that could fly 1,000 miles from base, fight at the top of the sky, and fly 1,000 miles home. That space did not exist in any Air Force's doctrine in 1940. The aircraft that would fill it had not yet flown, and the men who ordered it did not know they were ordering it. The story of the Mustang is not the story of a perfect design arriving fully formed. It is the story of an airframe that was right and an engine that was wrong, joined for 2 years to the wrong power, and transformed only when a foreign engine was bolted where the original had been. Everything that made it famous came after that swap. Everything that made it necessary came from a crisis it was not designed to solve. How do you take an aircraft that failed at the one job that mattered and make it the best in the world at exactly that job? That question sits at the center of this machine. Answering it will require following the Mustang from a drawing office in California to a test field in England, from the bomber routes over Germany to the open water off Iwo Jima, from the frozen ridgelines of Korea to the surplus lots and air race pylons of the years after. It is a story of requirements, engines, factories, and consequences. Chapter 1. The fighter Britain ordered and America would not build. Britain needed fighters in 1940, and it had no factories left to spare. Its own plants were running at capacity, and every one of them was inside range of German bombers. So Britain went shopping in America, and America offered it an airplane it did not want. The buyers were the British Purchasing Commission, a body sent across the Atlantic to convert money into aircraft as fast as money could move. Their shopping list was simple and urgent. They wanted the Curtiss P-40, a fighter already in production, already flying, already understood. What they wanted from North American aviation was more P-40s, built under license, to fill out the numbers. North American was a comparatively young company. It built trainers and bombers. It had never designed and produced a single-seat fighter that reached frontline service. The company's leadership made an unusual counteroffer. Rather than build another firm's fighter, they proposed to design their own, and to do it fast enough to matter. That proposal carried a specific promise. North American would deliver a prototype in a matter of months, not the years such a program normally took. The British agreed to gamble. On the 29th of May, 1940, they placed an order for 320 aircraft. The terms were exacting. The unit cost was not to exceed $40,000. The armament was to include 4 rifle-caliber machine guns of .303-inch bore. The first aircraft was expected quickly, and the clock started at once. That decision needs context, because a popular version of it has hardened into legend. The retelling holds that North American was simply told to copy the P-40 and refused. The record is more precise. North American did negotiate access to Curtiss test data as part of the arrangement, and the British did initially want the proven design. What North American secured was permission to substitute a new airframe of its own, provided it could be delivered on the same brutal schedule. The company did not defy the customer. It persuaded the customer to accept a different risk. The men who stood to lose were the British officers counting airframes they did not yet have. Every month spent waiting for an unproven design was a month the existing squadrons flew without reinforcement. A license-built P-40 was a known quantity. It would arrive as expected, perform as expected, and add to the total in a predictable way. A clean-sheet fighter from a company with no fighter record was a wager against time. That wager rested on a trade. A bespoke design promised more than a license copy could give. It could use the newest aerodynamic thinking, carry more fuel, and reach higher speeds on the same power. Those advantages were real on paper. They were worth nothing if the airframe arrived late, or arrived broken, or never arrived at all. The British were buying a promise from a firm that had not yet proven it could keep it. There was a second cost hidden inside the contract, and it would shape the entire early life of the aircraft. The engine was fixed before the airframe was drawn. The British specification and American availability pointed to a single power plant. the Allison V-1710, the only mass-produced American liquid-cooled fighter engine of the moment. It was a capable engine with one defining limitation, and that limitation was not yet understood to be fatal. The airframe would be optimized around it. The men designing the aircraft would build the finest structure they could, and they would bolt it to the only heart available. The contract, then, set two clocks running at once. One was the delivery clock, measured in days, a public promise the company had to keep to survive. The other was a slower clock, invisible in 1940, measured in the altitude at which the war would eventually be decided. North American could control the first. It could do nothing about the second. The airframe it was about to draw would be excellent. The engine it was forced to accept would be adequate low and useless high. The company had agreed to build a fighter in a season. The season had begun. Chapter 2. 100 Days to First Flight. A new fighter normally took years to move from contract to first flight. North American had agreed to do it in a matter of months, and the promise was not rhetorical. The prototype rolled out of the factory roughly 100 days after the contract was signed. The man at the center of the design was Edgar Schmude, a German-born engineer whose name would stay attached to the airframe for the rest of its life. He led a team that worked against the calendar rather than around it. The aircraft they produced was designated the NA-73X, a single prototype that carried the entire wager of the program. It was built from 24S aluminum alloy, formed into a semi-monocoque fuselage in three main sections, joined so that the skin itself carried much of the load. The construction was conventional in principle and exacting in execution. The wing was not conventional. The team adopted a laminar flow airfoil, a shape developed with the National Aeronautics Laboratory and designated in the 45100 series. The idea behind it was simple to state and difficult to achieve. A wing that kept air flowing smoothly across more of its surface, delaying the break into turbulence, would generate far less drag. Less drag meant more speed on the same power and more range on the same fuel. On paper, the reduction ran as high as 25 to 50% against older sections. That figure needs restraint, because it became one of the aircraft's most repeated claims. The wing was genuinely advanced, and it did reduce drag. But true laminar flow demanded a surface close to perfect, and no combat aircraft in service kept such a surface. Rivet heads, panel seams, uneven paint, dust, rain, and even insect residue struck the leading edge and tripped the airflow into turbulence far sooner than the wind tunnel promised. The wing was excellent. It was not magic. The real gains were smaller than the laboratory numbers, and honest accounts of the aircraft have said so ever since. Beneath the fuselage, behind the wing, sat the feature that would matter most to the aircraft's eventual speed: a large radiator duct, a scoop that fed cooling air to the liquid-cooled engine. Its placement and shaping were the subject of careful work, because a cooling system is a drag penalty by nature, and the team was trying to recover as much of that penalty as the physics allowed. The duct's story would return later, when the aircraft's speed became a matter of national argument. For now, it was one more surface to get right. The men who felt the schedule most were not the pilots. They were the draftsmen and toolmakers at Inglewood, working the wing's tolerances by hand, translating a low-drag theory into panels a factory could actually build. A laminar wing was only as good as its finish. Every seam that stood proud, every rivet that sat high, gave back a fraction of the drag the design had chased. The people who closed that gap did it at drawing boards and on shop floors, not in the air. On the 26th of October, 1940, the prototype flew. The test pilot was Vance Breeze. The aircraft that lifted off was, by the standards of the moment, remarkably clean, remarkably fast for its power, and remarkably far along for a company that had never built a fighter. The delivery clock had been beaten. The gamble on the airframe had paid. The trade buried in that achievement was the same one every aircraft makes. The Mustang had chased low drag above almost everything else, and low drag bought speed and range that its rivals could not match. But the pursuit demanded a manufacturing finish few plants could reproduce at scale, and it locked the design around a slender, efficient shape that depended entirely on the power feeding it. A clean airframe multiplies whatever the engine gives it. It cannot give what the engine withholds. And the engine was about to withhold a great deal. The airframe that flew that October was one of the finest of its generation. The thing bolted to its nose was not, and the place where it fell short was the exact place the war would soon be fought. Chapter 3. Fast down low, blind up high. The Mustang flew beautifully near the ground. The war that would decide the outcome was being fought 4 miles above it. The engine was the Allison V-1710, and its defining feature was a single-stage supercharger. A supercharger forces air into the engine to keep it making power as the surrounding air thins with altitude. A single-stage unit does this well up to a point and then runs out of capacity. For the Allison, that point came low. The engine delivered around 1,150 horsepower, and its best work was done near 11,800 feet. Above roughly 15,000 feet, its power fell away quickly. The higher the aircraft climbed, the weaker its heart became. Down low, this was no handicap at all. Near the ground, the Allison Mustang was fast, smooth, and long-legged, better in several respects than the fighters around it. The Royal Air Force understood exactly what it had. It did not throw the aircraft away. It assigned it to the work it could do superbly. From early 1942, RAF Mustangs flew armed tactical reconnaissance, ranging low across occupied France and the Low Countries, photographing, strafing, and returning at speeds that made them hard to catch. The 1st Squadron took the type into service, and the aircraft did that job as well as anything in the inventory. The United States Army Air Forces, meanwhile, showed little interest. The aircraft had been built on a British contract, to a British requirement, and the American service had its own fighters and its own priorities. For a time, the Mustang existed in an odd position, a first-rate airframe. In production, admired by the men who flew it low, and largely ignored by the Air Force in whose country it was built. When American money did flow to the design, it flowed into a role that fit the engine rather than fought it. In 1942, with fighter appropriations exhausted, the airframe was reborn as a dive bomber to keep the production line alive. 500 were built as the A-36, fitted with rectangular slatted dive brakes above and below the wings, powered by a 1500 series Allison of about 1,325 horsepower. It carried up to 1,000 pounds of bombs on 2 underwing racks, reached around 365 miles per hour, and topped out near 25,000 feet. It went to war over Sicily and Italy and in the skies of Burma. The A-36 also earned a grim distinction. In training, it developed one of the highest accident rates per flying hour of any Army aircraft, and at least one machine shed both wings, pulling out of a dive near 450 miles per hour. Some units wired the dive brakes shut and dived without them. In combat, the type claimed 84 aircraft shot down and lost 177 of its own to enemy action. It was a hard aircraft, flown in a hard role, and by the middle of 1944, it had been replaced by other types. The A-36 pilot over Sicily, dive brakes extended, pulling out of a screaming descent with 1,000 pounds gone from under his wings, was flying the same airframe that would later escort bombers to Berlin. He was flying it in the only role its engine allowed. A myth has grown around this period, and it deserves correction. The early Mustang is often described as a failure. The evidence does not support that. It was one of the best low-altitude fighters of its moment, excellent in reconnaissance, capable as a fighter bomber, and superior to many contemporaries below 15,000 feet. It did not fail. It was simply matched to the wrong altitude for the war that was coming. The problem was not the aircraft. The problem was where the aircraft could not go. That mismatch was the whole of it. The Allison was cheap, reliable, and effective low, and those same qualities came from a simplicity that could not sustain power high. The airframe could clearly fly higher than the engine could pull it. Every advantage the design had chased, the speed, the range, the clean, low-drag shape, waited unused above the altitude where the engine quit. The men who flew it low got a superb machine. The men who needed a high escort got nothing from it at all. The fix would not come from an American drawing board. It would come from an engine already flying in another country's fighter, and from a test pilot who flew the Mustang once and heard exactly what it was missing. Chapter 4. The British Heart. A Rolls-Royce test pilot flew the Mustang in the spring of 1942 and heard what it was missing. What it was missing was already flying, in quantity, in the Spitfire. The pilot was Ronald Harker, known within Rolls-Royce simply as Ronnie, a man whose day job was evaluating engines and airframes. In April 1942, he flew an Allison-powered Mustang and formed a clear judgment. The aircraft was a disappointing performer at higher altitude, though it handled well and performed adequately in the middle band. He recognized the airframe's quality immediately, and he recognized just as quickly that it was being strangled by its power plant. His conclusion was specific. The aircraft did not need a new wing or a new fuselage. It needed the engine that was already turning Britain's best interceptors into high-altitude fighters. That engine was the Rolls-Royce Merlin, and the version Harker had in mind carried a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger. Where the Allison's single supercharger ran out of breath low, the Merlin's arrangement compressed the incoming air twice, in 2 stages, and could shift between 2 gear speeds to match the thinning atmosphere. The result was an engine that held its power far higher. A Merlin 61 produced around 1,390 horsepower at 23,500 feet, an altitude at which the Allison had almost nothing left to give. The airframe that was blind above 15,000 feet would, with such an engine, see clearly at twice that height. Harker's advocacy was persistent enough that it attached his name to the outcome. He became known, in the shorthand of the story, as the man who put the Merlin in the Mustang. That shorthand is where the record needs restraint. The popular telling credits one man with single-handedly saving the aircraft. Harker did champion the idea, and his flight report set it moving. But an idea is not an engine change. The proposal met resistance from an air ministry with no appetite for diverting scarce Merlins into an American airframe. It moved forward only because a senior figure, Air Chief Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman, authorized a trial. Rolls-Royce engineers then had to make the installation real. Harker lit the fuse. Others built the charge. The trial took physical form as a small conversion program. From the late summer of 1942, 5 Mustang airframes were taken in hand at Rolls-Royce and re-engined with the Merlin 65, a variant of the two-stage engine. The converted aircraft received the designation Mustang X. The first of them flew on the 13th of October, 1942, with the company's chief test pilot, R.T. Shepard, at the controls, from the aerodrome at Hucknall. By December, the trials had produced results the reports called spectacular. At altitude, the aircraft was transformed. The same clean airframe that had wallowed above 15,000 feet now performed at the top of the sky. The man in the cockpit of that first conversion was flying an experiment, not a weapon. The airframe was familiar. The power was not. Where the Allison had gone soft as the altimeter climbed, the Merlin kept pulling, and the aircraft kept accelerating into air that should have starved it. The promise the design had carried since 1940, the clean wing and the long range waiting above the engine's ceiling, was finally being fed. The transformation carried a cost, as every transformation in this story does. The two-stage Merlin was a heavier engine than the Allison, and a thirstier one. It demanded more cooling, more fuel, and more careful installation. The gains at altitude were bought with weight and complexity at every altitude, and the engine was in desperately short supply. Britain needed every Merlin it could build for its own fighters and bombers. The Mustang X proved the concept, and then ran straight into the limit that the concept could not solve. There were not enough British engines to spare for an American aircraft. Britain had proved the idea and could not scale it. The airframe was American, the airframe's future was American, and the transformation would only matter if it could be built by the thousand. That meant the British engine would have to become an American one. Chapter 5. An American Merlin. A British engine could not power an American mass production program, so America built the British engine itself. The mechanism for this already existed. The Packard Motor Car Company had been licensed to manufacture the Rolls-Royce Merlin in the United States, producing it under the designation V1650. This was not a loose adaptation. It was the Merlin, built to Rolls-Royce drawings on American tooling, in numbers a car company knew how to reach. The license meant that the transformation proved on 5 converted airframes in England could be repeated on thousands of airframes coming off lines in California and Texas. North American received authorization to install the two-stage engine in airframes of its own. 2 aircraft ordered under British contract were taken in hand and fitted with the Merlin 65. The first American Merlin Mustang, designated XP-51B, flew on the 30th of November, 1942, piloted by Bob Chilton. It was powered by a Packard V1653, producing around 1,450 horsepower. The definitive fighter that followed would carry the V1657, and the aircraft built around it would reach roughly 440 miles per hour at altitude, with a service ceiling near 42,000 feet. The blind aircraft could now see to the top of the war. The worker who made that possible was not a pilot or an engineer with his name in the histories. He was a machinist on a Packard line in Detroit, cutting to tolerances specified by a British engine maker, producing a component that had to interchange perfectly with parts made 1,000 miles away. That arrangement depended entirely on precision. An American Merlin that was almost a Merlin would have been worthless. The whole value of the license lay in exactness. That exactness is the subject of another myth worth correcting. It is sometimes said that the Packard Merlins were inferior copies, cheaper imitations of the British original. The record does not support the sneer. Packard built the engine to its own manufacturing methods, and in several respects those methods held tighter tolerances and suited mass production better than the hand-fitting Rolls-Royce had relied upon. The 2 engines were built differently. One was not lesser. The point of the license was to keep quality while multiplying quantity, and it did. The performance leap was not subtle, and the men who flew both versions described it in plain terms. One American ace said the Merlin engine went like hell, and attributed it directly to the 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger that kept power available across the altitude range. Another summarized what the transformation delivered in a single word repeated 3 times. Asked what qualities a fighter needed to escort bombers to Berlin, he answered, range, range, and range. The Merlin gave the airframe the altitude to fight and the efficiency to reach. Both mattered. Neither had existed in the Allison version. The trade behind the American Merlin was strategic as much as mechanical. Licensing a foreign engine let the United States field its best fighter far faster than developing an equivalent from scratch would have allowed. That exchange bought speed and quantity at a price rarely stated aloud. America's finest fighter of the war was powered by a British design, built under British license, carrying a British engineering heritage in its cylinders. The airframe was American. The heart was not. The aircraft that would come to symbolize American air power was, at its core, an act of borrowing. With the engine solved and the license running, the aircraft could finally be understood as a single working whole rather than a good airframe waiting for adequate power. Every part of it now pulled in the same direction. To see how, it helps to follow the machine through one complete pass over the enemy, from the climb to the burst of gunfire, watching each system do its job. Chapter 6. One Pass Over Germany. The Merlin Mustang was not a collection of good parts. It was a single system, and it is best understood in one firing pass. The pass began in a climb. As the aircraft rose and the air thinned, the two-stage supercharger did its work in the first stage, compressing the incoming air before it reached the engine. At a set altitude, as the air grew thinner still, the supercharger shifted to its higher gear, spinning faster to force more of the thinning atmosphere into the cylinders. The pilot felt this as a surge, a renewal of power at a height where the old Allison would have been fading. The engine did not simply resist altitude. It changed its behavior to match the altitude it was in. That arrangement was the whole difference between the two versions of the aircraft, and it operated automatically as the fight climbed. Beneath the fuselage, the radiator duct earned its keep. Cooling air entered the scoop, passed through the radiator where it absorbed heat from the engine's coolant, expanded as it warmed, and exited rearward through an adjustable opening. This is the principle sometimes called the Meredith effect, after the engineer who described it. Hot air leaving a duct at speed can push backward against the airflow, recovering some of the drag that the cooling system imposes. On the Mustang, the installation was careful, and the recovery was real. The size of that recovery is a favorite claim, and it needs restraint. Enthusiastic accounts say the radiator produced net thrust, that the cooling system actually pushed the aircraft forward. The evidence supports a narrower statement. The duct recovered a large share of the drag that cooling would otherwise have cost, and it did so better than most rival installations. Claims of positive net thrust go beyond what the measurements will bear. The honest version is still remarkable. The Mustang paid less for its cooling than almost any fighter that flew, and that thrift was part of why it was faster and longer range than other aircraft on the same Merlin engine. The airframe wasted less of what the engine gave it. The duct design also solved a specific early problem. The original intake sat too close to the fuselage skin, swallowing the slow, turbulent boundary layer of air that clings to the surface. Moving the scoop a few inches away from the fuselage let it draw on clean, fast-moving air instead, and the rough running smoothed out. A few inches of standoff bought back both efficiency and manners. The margin between a good cooling installation and a bad one was measured in the width of a hand. At the top of the pass came the guns. The definitive P-51D carried 6 half-inch Browning machine guns in the wings, 3 to a side, mounted upright and fed cleanly. When the pilot pressed the button, the 6 guns fired together, and the aircraft's whole low-drag shape became a gun platform aimed by the fuselage. That upright mounting was itself a correction. The earlier B&C models had carried only 4 guns, and they had been installed at an angle, canted over to fit the thin wing. Under the hard-turning loads of combat, the ammunition belts in those inclined guns could bind and stop, and pilots found their firepower failing at the exact moment they needed it. The record is careful about causes, because a stoppage can have many. A jam might come from the feed geometry, the ammunition, the loading, or the G-forces of the turn. But the inclined installation was a known contributor, and the D model addressed it directly, standing the guns upright and adding a 6th. The bubble canopy that also arrived with the D gave the pilot the all-around view the earlier framed canopy had denied him. Those fixes carried their own small price, the recurring bargain of the whole aircraft. Upright guns and a raised bubble canopy cured real faults, and they cost a fraction of the very drag the design had spent years chasing. The aircraft gave back a sliver of its clean shape to gain reliable firepower and a pilot who could see the enemy behind him. It was a trade worth making, and it was still a trade. One aircraft flew that pass. The war needed thousands of them in the air at once, and thousands of aircraft flying deep into Germany needed something the pass itself could not supply, enough fuel to get there and back. The range that made the Mustang matter was not won in the cockpit. It was won in the factories and inside a tank behind the pilot's seat. Chapter 7. The Fuselage Tank and the Factories. Escort range was not won in the air. It was won on the factory floor and inside an 85-gallon tank fitted behind the pilot's seat. The factories came first in scale. The Merlin Mustang was built at 2 main American plants, at Inglewood in California and at Dallas in Texas, and the totals it reached place it among the great production programs of the war. Counts vary with how the variants and foreign-built machines are added, but the whole family ran to something on the order of 15,000 aircraft, and by some tallies past 17,000. The definitive P-51D alone accounted for more than 8,000, split between the two American plants, with a further 200 assembled in Australia. That arrangement depended on interchangeability, on parts made in Texas, fitting airframes built in California, and on both matching engines built in Detroit. A program that size is a logistical achievement before it is ever a combat one. Fuel came second, and it was the harder problem. An engine that runs efficiently at altitude still burns fuel, and a fighter that must fly 1,000 miles out and 1,000 miles back must carry an enormous quantity of it relative to its size. The Mustang's internal tanks held 184 gallons in the wings. That alone was not enough to reach the deep targets. Two answers extended the reach. The first was external, drop tanks slung under the wings, in sizes from 75 to over 100 gallons each, carried, outbound, and released when empty or when combat began. The second was internal and more troublesome. An 85-gallon tank fitted into the fuselage, behind the pilot, filling space the airframe had not originally been designed to carry fuel in. The crew chief who topped that fuselage tank knew exactly what he was doing to the aircraft. He was adding range, and he was moving the aircraft's balance. Fuel behind the pilot sits well aft of the center of gravity, and a full fuselage tank shifted the aircraft's balance rearward, toward instability. A Mustang taking off with that tank full was a different, twitchier machine than the same Mustang with it empty. The fix was procedural rather than mechanical. Pilots drew fuel from the fuselage tank first, early in the flight, burning it down before they reached the area where they might have to fight. By the time combat was likely, the dangerous tank was empty, and the balance had returned to normal. Range was bought, and the price was a stretch of the mission flown in an aircraft that had to be handled with care. That sequence is worth stating plainly, because it corrects a comfortable assumption. It is easy to say that range came with the Merlin, that the great engine simply gave the aircraft legs. The truth is more divided. Range came from fuel volume and from drop tanks, from the wing tanks and the fuselage tank and the external stores. What the Merlin added was the ability to use that fuel efficiently at the altitude where the bombers flew. The engine made the range usable. The tanks made the range exist. Neither did the other's job. The second-order consequence of the fuselage tank ran deeper than takeoff handling. It changed how missions were flown and how pilots were trained. A fighter that is unstable when full and stable when empty imposes a discipline on the man flying it. He cannot simply firewall the throttle and climb away. He must manage his fuel in a set order, monitor his balance, and know that an emergency early in the flight, before the aft tank has drained, will find him in the least forgiving version of his aircraft. The tank that let the Mustang reach Berlin also made the first hour of every deep mission a matter of careful bookkeeping. The reach was real. So was the constraint that came with it. With full tanks and released drop tanks, the Merlin Mustang could now do what no single-engine fighter had reliably done before. It could accompany heavy bombers from England to targets deep inside Germany and return. That capability arrived at a moment when it was not a convenience, but a necessity, because the bombing campaign it was built to protect was, by late 1943, being taken apart in the air over Germany. Chapter 8. The bombers were dying. American doctrine held that heavy bombers could defend themselves. Over Germany in 1943, that doctrine was bleeding to death. The theory had a logic. A large bomber bristled with defensive machine guns, and a tight formation of such bombers concentrated that fire into overlapping fields that an attacking fighter had to cross. In principle, a self-defending formation could fly to a target without escort and shoot its way through anything that rose to meet it. The daylight precision campaign that the American Air Forces began over occupied Europe rested on this belief. Bombers went out by day, in formation, to strike specific targets, and for a time they went without fighters that could stay with them all the way. The theory failed against the arithmetic of the German fighter force. When the bombers pushed beyond the range of their short-legged escorts, the escorts turned back, and the bombers flew on, alone, into the most heavily defended airspace in the world. German fighters attacked in the gap, unhurried and unopposed by anything but the bombers' own guns. The losses in these deep, unescorted raids reached a level the campaign could not sustain. Missions against targets far inside Germany produced casualty rates that would have consumed the bomber force in a matter of weeks if repeated. After the worst of them, the deepest unescorted penetrations were halted. The self-defending bomber had been tested against reality and found wanting. The man who felt this most directly was the gunner in the bomber. He watched the friendly fighters that had shepherded the formation reach the limit of their fuel and peel away at the German frontier, waggling their wings and turning for home. Beyond that point, he was on his own, firing a machine gun from a freezing open position, watching the German fighters form up in the distance for their runs. The escorts did not abandon him out of cowardice or failure. They abandoned him because they could not carry the fuel to stay. The range gap was not a tactic. It was a fact of physics, and it was killing men. The escorts that existed could not close that gap. The thick, powerful Thunderbolt and the twin-engine Lightning both did essential work, and both could reach a considerable distance. But neither could stay with the bombers to the deepest targets and fight there and return. Each had range, and each ran out of it before the target when the target lay far enough east. The bombers needed an escort that could go the whole way, fight at the top of the sky, and come home. Until such an aircraft existed in numbers, the daylight campaign was trapped between a doctrine it could no longer trust and targets it could no longer reach. Here, the record requires restraint, because the story is often compressed into a single savior. It is said that the P-51 alone saved the bombing campaign, that the Mustang arrived and the crisis simply ended. The fuller account shares the credit. The Thunderbolt and the Lightning carried the escort war through its hardest period and inflicted heavy losses on the German fighter force in the process. What the Mustang did was close the last and deepest part of the gap, the stretch that the others could not cover, and it did so in growing numbers at the moment that stretch mattered most. It was the aircraft that could finally go all the way. It was not the only aircraft that fought. The trade at the heart of this chapter belonged to doctrine rather than machinery. Daylight precision bombing promised accuracy that night bombing could not match, the ability to aim at a factory rather than a city. That promise was real, and it was paid for in bomber crews for as long as no escort could reach the target. The bill came due over Germany in 1943, and it was paid in aircraft and men until an escort with the range to stay could change the terms. The Mustang gave the campaign that range. What happened next was not decided by the aircraft alone. It was decided by an order, given in January 1944, that changed what the escorts were allowed to do. Chapter 9. Destroy the German Air Force. For most of a year, the escort fighters had been chained to the bombers they protected. In January 1944, a new commander unchained them. The doctrine before then was defensive by design. Fighters were tied to the bomber stream, ordered to stay close and drive off attackers, to bring the bombers back alive. That instruction was well meant and, on its own terms, sound. A fighter flying tight formation with the bombers could break up an attack as it came in, but it also surrendered the initiative entirely. The escorts waited to be attacked, reacted to the enemy's timing, and could not pursue a broken formation of German fighters without abandoning their charges. They protected. They did not hunt. The change came with a change of command. When Major General James Doolittle took over the 8th Air Force, he visited his fighter command and found a sign on the wall stating that the first duty of the fighters was to bring the bombers back alive. He ordered it taken down. He replaced its message with a blunter one. The first duty of the fighters was to destroy German fighters. The distinction was total. The escorts were no longer to wait by the bombers for the enemy to come. They were to go out ahead, find the German fighters, and kill them, in the air and on their fields. Doolittle later called this the most important and far-reaching military decision he made during the war, and also the most controversial. The controversy was real, and it was not foolish. Releasing the fighters to range ahead meant that individual bomber formations would, at times, be left without a fighter directly beside them. To the bomber crews, watching their close escort disappear over the horizon in search of the enemy, it could look like abandonment. Doolittle was making a calculated exchange. He was trading the reassurance of a fighter on the wing for the destruction of the force that threatened every mission to come. The tactics followed the order outward. Escort formations widened from tight cover to sweeps 25 miles across, with squadrons ranging ahead of the bombers. Soon, whole fighter groups pushed 50 miles forward, intercepting German fighters as they climbed to attack, before they could reach the bomber stream at all. And the fighters went down to the airfields, strafing parked aircraft, catching the German force on the ground where a machine destroyed was a machine that would never rise again. The Mustang's range made all of this possible. A fighter that could go the whole distance could also wander the whole distance, hunting. The pilot released to hunt was flying a different war than the one his predecessors had flown a year before. He was no longer a shield. He was a weapon sent to find the enemy at his most numerous and his most defended, over his own bases, and to fight him there. That was where the German Air Force was strongest. And by design, that was where the Mustangs now went. The results came in a concentrated form in February 1944. In the offensive remembered as Big Week, when American formations struck the German aircraft industry and drew the German fighters up to defend it. The fighting in that period destroyed a large share of the German force's experienced pilots, by one accounting 17% of them in air combat. The broader attrition ran deeper still. Across the opening months of 1944, the German fighter arm in Western Europe lost a third of its strength in January and more than half in February. Aircraft could be replaced. The trained pilots who flew them could not at that rate, and the loss of them was the loss the German force could not survive. The trade Doolittle had made proved out. Ranging ahead broke the German fighter force by seeking it where it lived, and it did so at the calculated cost of leaving individual bomber boxes momentarily uncovered. He had gambled that killing the enemy air force would protect more bombers over time than guarding them one formation at a time ever could. The gamble was the most controversial call he made, and it was decisive. The machine had won its theater. But a fighter is flown by men, and men make records and legends in equal measure. The Mustang's story, from this point, belongs partly to the pilots who flew it, and partly to the myths that grew around what they did. Chapter 10. The Men and the Myths. The Mustang's record was made by pilots, and pilots make legends. Some of those legends need correcting, and the correction takes nothing away from the men. The numbers the pilots produced were real and large. The American fighter groups flying Mustangs claimed thousands of German aircraft destroyed in the air and thousands more on the ground, at a cost of their own that ran into the low thousands. Individual groups posted totals that would once have seemed impossible. One group claimed 664 victories in the air, another 565. These were not the scores of a handful of heroes. They were the output of squadrons flying constantly, deep into enemy territory, in an aircraft that could take them there and bring them back. The individual pilots became known by their tallies. The highest-scoring Mustang ace was credited with somewhere in the range of 24 victories flying the type, a total built over many missions against a capable enemy. His story also carries the arbitrary cruelty of the war that produced it. He was killed on Christmas Day of 1944, shot down not by a German fighter but by American anti-aircraft fire, brought down by his own side in the confusion of a low fight. The best of them were not immune to the war's randomness. The same sky that made his record ended his life by accident. The Mustang's reach also opened a second front for its pilots, far from Germany, over the Pacific. As American forces took islands within range of Japan, the Mustang flew very long-range escort missions that tested the men as much as the machine. From forward island bases, the fighters escorted bombers toward Japan across vast stretches of open ocean. Missions of many hours in a single-engine aircraft with nothing but water below. The pilot on such a mission faced a particular kind of strain. His engine had to run perfectly for hours. A failure over that ocean meant ditching alone, far from any land, with the odds of rescue set against him. That overwater reach was a trade like every other in the aircraft's life. The single engine and the long range gave the Mustang the ability to escort across distances that shorter-legged fighters could not attempt. The same single engine gave the pilot no redundancy over the sea. A twin-engine fighter that lost one engine could limp home. A Mustang that lost its one engine over the Pacific was gone. The range that made the mission possible also made the mission unforgiving. The men who flew it accepted that arithmetic every time they crossed the coast outbound. The most persistent myth attached to the Mustang's pilots belongs to the Tuskegee Airmen, the black fighter groups whose escort record became a point of pride and, over time, a point of exaggeration. The famous claim holds that they never lost a bomber under their escort to enemy fighters, not a single one across the whole campaign. That claim requires restraint, and the correction comes from careful research into the official records. Bombers under their escort were shot down on several occasions, on 7 different days across 1944 and into 1945. With the documented total on the order of 27 bombers lost to enemy aircraft. The record shows something more useful than perfection. The average number of bombers lost per fighter group in that force was around 46. The Tuskegee group lost about 27. Their record was not flawless. It was distinctly better than the average, which is a harder and truer thing to have earned. The myth of never losing a bomber made a good record into an impossible one, and in doing so, it obscured the real achievement. A group that protected its bombers more effectively than most, under scrutiny that most groups never faced. The accurate claim honors them more than the myth does, because the accurate claim is true. Even as the aces flew and the records grew, the aircraft itself was still changing. Engineers who had watched the D-model fight were already building a lighter, faster Mustang, one that would prove superior to every version that came before, and that the war would barely have time to use. Chapter 11. Lighter, faster, too late. The D-model won the war it was built for. The best Mustang of all arrived after that war had already been decided. The variant line tells the story of steady refinement. The early Merlin fighters, the B and the C, carried a framed canopy over a raised fuselage spine, the arrangement known as the Razorback, which limited the pilot's view to the rear. The D model cut that spine down and fitted a clear bubble canopy, giving the pilot the all-around vision that combat demanded, and it standardized the 6-gun armament. A parallel model built at the Texas plant differed mainly in its propeller and minor fittings. These were the aircraft that filled the escort groups and flew the deep missions, and they were built in the thousands because they arrived when the numbers were needed. Then came the aircraft that outperformed them all. The P-51H was a comprehensive lightening and refinement of the design, reworked to shed weight and gain speed, and it reached roughly 487 miles per hour, faster than any Mustang that had fought. It was, by the measurable standards of speed and climb, the finest of the entire family. It was built in modest numbers, on the order of 555, and it entered service as the war was ending. The best version of the aircraft arrived, with almost no war left for it to fight. There was also a Mustang that stopped being a single Mustang at all. The twin Mustang joined two fighter fuselages to a common wing and tail, a design aimed at the very long-range escort problem that the Pacific had exposed, where a pilot might fly for 8 hours or more and a second crewman and a second engine offered relief and reliability. It was a logical answer to a real need, and like the H model, it arrived at the edge of the conflict that had called for it, too late to do the job in the war that inspired it. The engineer ringing out the H model in flight test was building toward a war that had just ended. He was refining an aircraft to a standard the fighting no longer required, chasing performance that would have been decisive a year earlier and was now, in the summer of the war's end, a peacetime luxury. The work was excellent. The timing had passed it by. A small myth attaches even here, and it is worth a correction because it touches the aircraft most people picture. The P-51D is often called the fastest Mustang, the ultimate expression of the type. The record places the D as the most important Mustang, not the fastest. The later H was faster and lighter, and by the raw numbers, a better fighter. The D earned its primacy not by being the peak of the design, but by being the version built in the numbers that mattered, at the time they mattered. Importance and superiority are not the same measurement, and the Mustang separates them cleanly. The trade in this final wartime chapter was the oldest one in engineering, paid in the currency of time. The pursuit of lightness and speed produced, in the H model, a genuinely superior fighter. That pursuit took long enough that the superior fighter missed its war, and the world it emerged into was already turning to jet propulsion, which would soon leave every piston fighter behind. The Mustang reached its highest form at the moment that form ceased to be what the future demanded. The best of the breed was overtaken, not by a better Mustang, but by a different kind of aircraft entirely. The Mustang's fighting life, though, was not over when the war ended. A second war was waiting, of a different character, and it would send the aircraft back down to the low altitudes where it had begun and expose the oldest weakness in its design. Chapter 12. The Second War and the Long Afterlife. The jet age made the Mustang obsolete as a first-line fighter almost overnight. Then Korea handed it a bomb load and sent it back down low, where it had started its life. By the time war came to Korea, the piston fighter had been eclipsed in the air superiority role by the jet, and the Mustang, now redesignated the F-51 under a new naming system, was no longer the answer to an enemy fighter at altitude. But the war on the ground needed aircraft that could carry ordnance, loiter over the battlefield, and strike targets in close support of troops. And there the Mustang still had value. It flew ground attack and reconnaissance, diving on positions, hitting supply lines, and working low over the terrain in exactly the kind of mission its Allison-powered ancestor had once been suited to. The aircraft had come full circle, back to the low altitudes where it had first proven useful. Low altitude was also where its oldest vulnerability waited. The Merlin, like all liquid-cooled engines, depended on a circulating coolant carried through lines and a radiator, and that system was exposed. A single bullet or fragment that punctured a coolant line or the radiator would drain the coolant, and an engine starved of coolant would overheat and seize within minutes. Down in the ground fire environment of close support, where every rifle and machine gun on the ground could reach the aircraft, this was a serious liability. The pilot over a Korean valley, having made his pass, watched his temperature gauge as closely as his instruments, knowing that a hit he might not even have felt could be quietly killing his engine. That vulnerability was the direct cost of the quality that had won the aircraft its fame. The liquid-cooled Merlin gave the Mustang the streamlined nose and the high-altitude power that made it a great escort fighter. An air-cooled radial engine, bulkier and draggier, would have been far harder to kill with a single hit because it had no coolant to lose. The Mustang had traded battlefield toughness for aerodynamic cleanliness, and that trade, invisible at 25,000 feet over Germany, became painfully visible at treetop height over Korea. The same engineering choice was a strength in one war and a weakness in the next. The aircraft's afterlife spread far beyond the two wars it fought for the United States. Mustangs served in the air forces of many nations, sold or transferred as surplus, flying for years in countries that could not build their own fighters. In American service, the type lingered at the margins long after the frontline squadrons had moved to jets. The last examples in the Air National Guard were withdrawn in the middle of the 1950s, and an individual aircraft served on into the late 1960s as a chase plane for an experimental program, flying alongside machines its designers could not have imagined when they drew it. The airframe outlived its era by decades. A final correction belongs here, because the Mustang's retirement is often misread. It is said the aircraft was retired because it was outdated, and in the air superiority sense that is true. But it was pulled back into service in Korea precisely because it was not useless. Its low-altitude strengths, its range, its load carrying, its stability as a gun and bomb platform still had value in a war fought close to the ground. The Mustang was not discarded as worthless. It was set aside as a fighter and recalled as an attacker, which is a more accurate account of how good aircraft actually leave service. They do not become bad. They become wrong for the newest job and right for an older one. What the Mustang finally proved was a requirement that no Air Force had believed in when the aircraft was ordered. In 1940, the idea of a single-engine fighter escorting heavy bombers to an enemy capital and back was not in anyone's doctrine. The range was thought impossible, the endurance beyond what one pilot and one engine could sustain. The Mustang demonstrated that the impossible requirement was real, and having demonstrated it, made it the standard that later aircraft, and eventually jets with far greater reach, would be built to meet. The aircraft that had failed at high-altitude escort in its first form ended by defining what high-altitude escort meant. Britain needed a fighter in 1940, and the fighter it received could not fight where the war would be decided. That is the plain problem at the root of everything that followed. An airframe of the first rank was joined to an engine that quit above 15,000 feet. And for 2 years, the finest single-seat design in the American inventory did honest work at the wrong altitude, flying reconnaissance low over France and diving on Sicily as a bomber, while 4 miles overhead the war it could have won was being lost without it. The arc from there is a chain of specific decisions and specific costs. A company promised a prototype in 100 days and delivered one, building a clean, laminar-winged airframe around the only engine available. That engine's ceiling condemned the aircraft to low-altitude rolls until a Rolls-Royce test pilot flew it in the spring of 1942 and named what it lacked. The two-stage Merlin, proven on 5 converted airframes in England, was licensed to Packard and built by the 1,000 in America, and it transformed the aircraft into a fighter that held its power to 42,000 feet. Range was added in fuel tanks under the wings and behind the pilot, the rearmost of which had to be burned off early because it made the aircraft unstable when full. A change of command in January 1944 released the escorts to hunt the German Air Force rather than merely shield the bombers, and in the concentrated fighting that followed, the German force lost the trained pilots it could not replace. The aircraft carried that new doctrine to Berlin, across the Pacific to Japan, and finally back down to the valleys of Korea, before passing into foreign air forces, surplus lots, and the hands of civilian racers who kept it flying long after its war was over. The central question was how an aircraft that failed at the one job that mattered could become the best in the world at exactly that job. The answer runs against the instinct that a great aircraft is a great design fully formed. The Mustang was made not by perfecting its airframe, but by replacing its heart, and then by building that heart in numbers no single nation's need could have justified. The airframe was always right. The engine was, for 2 years, wrong. Everything that made the aircraft famous came from correcting a single mismatch, and everything that made the correction possible came from a foreign design built under license by a car company. The greatness was assembled, not born, and it was assembled across 2 nations and against a deadline measured first in days and later in the lives of bomber crews. America built an airframe and could not make it fight. Britain gave it an engine, and it never stopped.